Welcome to Silent Reveng. Meet the Family Embarrassment. My brother Marcus said to his groomsmen loud enough for me to hear across the country club's lounge, gesturing in my direction like I was a cautionary tale someone had brought along for entertainment value. She works at a grocery store. That's what happens when you don't apply yourself in life. Our parents paid for her education, and this is what she does with it. The groomsmen laughed. That particular kind of laugh that comes from people who are just uncomfortable enough to be cruel, but comfortable enough in their own privilege that they do and question whether mockery is appropriate at someone's family event. I was standing there in the bridesmaid dress I'd paid for myself, the one that cost more than some people's monthly rent, watching my oldest brother reduce my entire existence to a punchline at his wedding rehearsal dinner while his future in-laws nodded along like this was the kind of conversation that happened at all family gatherings. So, I did what I'd been trained to do my entire life. I smiled. I said nothing, and I walked away with the kind of composure that comes from decades of practice at being invisible, leaving the men to enjoy their joke at my expense. But then, as I was heading toward the exit, a man in an immaculate Armani suit intercepted me, extended his hand with a grip that suggested military background, and said something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this entire evening. "Miss Anderson, I'm Jackson Morrison, your head of security. Shall we leave?" That's when I understood that my brother had no idea who I actually was. And the shock of that realization was somehow worse than the humiliation. My name is Gabriel Louise Anderson, and I'm 39 years old, though most people would estimate me at 10 years younger based on the kind of life I've been able to afford to live. I come from suburban Chicago, a family where success was measured by very specific metrics that had been established long before I was even born. Corporate position, salary, visibility, the kind of achievement that could be announced at country club dinners and would immediately translate to someone's exact position in the social hierarchy. My father, Richard Anderson, was a tax attorney with clients that ranged from Fortune 500 companies to wealthy individuals. My mother, Catherine, was a hospital administrator who'd sacrificed her early career aspirations to support my father's rise, a sacrifice she'd never let any of us forget. My three older brothers were all on track to meet or exceed the family's established definition of success. Marcus was the venture capitalist making over $500,000 annually. Derek was the corporate attorney climbing the partnership track at a prestigious Chicago law firm. And Timothy was the hedge fund manager living in a penthouse on the Gold Coast. And then there was me. I was supposed to follow the same trajectory. The expectation had been set so early and so firmly that it had calcified into something that felt like destiny. My parents had already been planning my future when I was still in middle school. They'd mentioned it to their friends at cocktail parties. They'd positioned it as inevitable, as though my path had already been written in invisible ink that only they could read. Law school was mentioned with the certainty of someone discussing whether the sun would rise tomorrow. A position at a major firm was discussed like it was a birthright. The trajectory was clear, predetermined, and completely disconnected from anything I might actually want. When I told my parents at 16 that I didn't want to be a lawyer, the reaction was immediate and devastating. My father said, "What do you want to do instead?" In that particular tone that suggested any alternative to his prescribed path was essentially incomprehensible to him. When I said I wasn't entirely sure yet, but that I was interested in urban agriculture and sustainable food systems, my father literally laughed. My mother said, "That's a nice hobby, dear, but you need a real career," my father added, with the finality of someone passing judgment on a legal case. "Well, you'd better figure out what that real career will be, because I am not paying for you to wander around college for years exploring yourself like some kind of hippie." So, I worked my way through college. I didn't argue. I didn't rebel in any dramatic way. I simply accepted that if I wanted to pursue something other than the predetermined path, I would have to fund it myself. I started working as a cashier at a Whole Foods supermarket in Chicago at 17, the summer before my senior year of high school. I showed up on time. I learned the system. I understood that work was something I could be good at if I paid attention. By the time I graduated high school and enrolled at Northwestern University, I was already a shift supervisor. I worked at the Whole Foods by day and took business classes at night, while my brothers were at fraternity parties and networking events designed to build their professional futures. I was learning everything about how a grocery store actually functioned. The supply chain management, the vendor relationships, the inventory systems, the profit margins that seemed thin until you understood volume and customer loyalty, the way a single product placement could impact purchasing decisions. I wasn't just working there because I needed the money, though that was certainly part of it. I was studying it like I was studying for a degree because I was beginning to understand that grocery stores were actually fascinating systems. They were logistics problems, community infrastructure, and social safety nets all combined into one entity. My mentor during those years was a woman named Diana Martinez, the store manager who'd worked her way up from cashier to regional management. Diana saw something in me and took the time to teach me not just how to do the job well, but how to think about the job strategically. She taught me that you could build something meaningful in the food retail space, that there was dignity and purpose in understanding how to feed communities, that the work wasn't beneath anyone, it was essential. By the time I graduated from Northwestern with a degree in business with a focus on sustainable economics, I'd been promoted to assistant manager. I could have moved into corporate retail at that point. Several regional chains had approached me about management training programs, positions that would have looked good to my family, roles that would have aligned with their expectations about what my career should look like. I could have taken the path that appeared on the surface to be the most legitimate. Instead, I had a different idea entirely. I'd been noticing something about urban grocery stores, particularly in lower neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago. They were closing at a rate of about one per year, not because they weren't needed, not because the communities weren't viable, but because the large chains had decided they weren't profitable enough. The corporations calculated that the margins in wealthy neighborhoods were better, that the demographic in lower income areas couldn't sustain the premium pricing needed to maintain corporate profits, and they simply walked away. What remained behind were food deserts, geographic areas where the nearest grocery store with fresh produce and whole foods was miles away, accessible only to people with cars and transportation flexibility, which meant they were inaccessible to most of the people who actually lived there. I'd been saving money since I was 16, not just from work, but from being deliberate about every expense. By 24, when I graduated from Northwestern, I had approximately $180,000 in savings. It sounds substantial until you start looking at the cost of opening and operating a grocery store, which starts around $2.7 million on the low end, can quickly scale to $5 million, and for larger format stores can exceed $10 million. The numbers seemed impossible for someone my age, with my background, with only my work experience to validate my capability. But what I understood in a way that most people didn't was that a smaller format grocery store, nothing fancy or artisanal, just clean and well organized with quality produce and bulk options and a focus on the actual needs of the community being served, could operate on significantly lower capital expenditure. I could buy a smaller space. I could focus on inventory that wouldn't spoil. I could build relationships with local suppliers and direct distributors instead of relying on massive corporate supply chains. So, I did something radical. I went back to school again. While working full-time, I earned an MBA in sustainable business from Northwestern, paying for it myself through a combination of my savings, student loans, and continued work at the grocery store. I learned about financing structures, about nonprofit models, about social enterprise, about how to build a business that could be both profitable and genuinely socially responsible. I wrote business plans. I studied economics and demographics and food system equity. I learned to think like a founder, like someone who could create something entirely new rather than simply rising through existing hierarchies. When I was 28, I opened my first store in a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side that hadn't had a full-service grocery store in 15 years. It was a converted warehouse that I'd purchased at a significant discount because it needed work. The interior was modest but meticulously clean, with exposed brick walls and track lighting that made the space feel bright and welcoming. The selection was curated specifically for what the neighborhood actually needed: An abundance of fresh produce, bulk dry goods, affordable proteins, staple items at prices that made sense for families on limited budgets. I staffed it with people from the neighborhood, trained them thoroughly, and paid them better than the minimum wage that most retail jobs offered. The store became a community hub. It became a place where people gathered not just to shop, but to see their neighbors, to feel seen and cared for in their own community. It created 43 jobs, which might not sound like much in the grand scheme of Chicago's employment landscape, but which meant 43 families in a neighborhood with 23% unemployment had reliable income. It reduced food insecurity in an area that had been systematically neglected by corporate retail. It increased property values and attracted other small businesses to the area. By 35, I had opened 8 stores across 3 states, Illinois, Michigan, and Indiana. Each one was profitably operated. Each one was located in an area that had been officially designated a food desert before my intervention. Each one had created jobs and fundamentally changed the economic and health landscape of the communities it served. I had a board of directors, an executive team, sophisticated financial systems, and a company that was being discussed in business school case studies as an innovative model for social enterprise. But my family didn't really understand what I did. When they asked about my work, which was infrequently as though the subject made them deeply uncomfortable, they seemed disappointed. "You own grocery stores?" my father would say in that particular tone of voice that suggested I'd just announced I was working at a circus or that I'd become a performance artist. My mother would mention it to her friends with the same inflection. She'd used to talk about my cousin's interesting hobby, the kind of tone that made it clear she was trying to be supportive while also distancing herself from the reality of what I actually did for a living. My brothers barely acknowledged it at all. They were busy with their own careers, their own trajectories, their own successes that fit neatly into categories the family could understand and celebrate. Marcus would occasionally make comments about how nice it must be to have a simple business without the complications of high finance. Comments that positioned what I did as small and manageable rather than complex and strategic. Derek would make jokes about my vegetable empire at family dinners. Timothy, who was the only one of them I actually had something resembling a real relationship with, would occasionally ask genuine questions about the business model. But even those questions seemed tinged with the assumption that I was doing something good, but ultimately not particularly impressive. I had never tried to correct this narrative. I had never positioned my work as anything other than what it appeared to be on the surface. I had never told my family that my company had been valued at $1,187 million in its last funding round. I had never mentioned that I controlled the majority stake. I had never told them that my net worth exceeded $140 million. I had never said that I had standing job offers from 3 Fortune 500 companies to become their chief sustainability officer. I had never discussed the fact that I was regularly invited to speak at international conferences about food system equity and sustainable development. I had never made my achievement visible to them because I had learned somewhere along the way that doing so would only create conflict, and I had decided that peace with my family was more valuable to me than their understanding. That invisibility had costs I hadn't fully calculated. Marcus' wedding was being held at the Ridgemore Country Club, an exclusive facility in Chicago, where membership cost more annually than most Americans made in a year. His fiancée, Sophie Whitmore, came from exactly the kind of family that would ensure this wedding would be discussed in Chicago as social circles for years. The families were aligned in their wealth, their values, their understanding of what success looked like and how it should be celebrated. Everything about the wedding was designed to project a very specific image: power, sophistication, family legacy, and the kind of happiness that could only be purchased through careful social positioning. I was asked to be a bridesmaid. I said yes, though the request carried with it an undertone of obligation rather than genuine desire to have me present in the way that people ask their siblings to participate in these events. I flew to New York a week before the wedding. I attended the rehearsal dinner. I participated in the pre-wedding events that bridesmaids are expected to attend. I paid for the bridesmaid dress, which cost $450 without complaining. I paid for my flight and my hotel room. I paid for the bridesmaid's gift that I was expected to contribute to. I did all of these things the way I had done things my entire life, quietly without making any demands, without asking for any acknowledgement of my own expenses or efforts. The comment at the rehearsal dinner wasn't even surprising. It was just a public version of what he'd been saying about me privately for years. The embarrassment, the disappointment, the sibling who hadn't achieved what was expected and therefore wasn't worth taking seriously. The family member who'd chosen a different path and therefore couldn't be trusted to understand the real world of high finance and prestige. I was standing near the bar holding a glass of wine that I was only half drinking when I heard Marcus's voice rise above the general chatter of the private room reserved for the wedding party. "Meet the family embarrassment," he was saying, and I turned slightly to see him gesturing in my direction while speaking to his groomsmen, his best man, his brothers, his future brother-in-law, various friends from his investment firm. "She works at a grocery store," he continued, and the way he said it made it sound like I worked at some kind of carnival stand rather than a sophisticated business operation. "That's what happens when you don't apply yourself in life. Our parents paid for her education, and this is what she does with it. Meanwhile, the rest of us are out there actually building empires." The groomsmen laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from people who are relying on the person making the joke to tell them whether mockery is appropriate. The kind of laugh that emerges from the safety of numbers and privilege and the assumption that nobody in the room will challenge you. I felt the familiar wash of emotions: shame, hurt, anger, resignation. I felt the weight of being unseen, of being reduced to a punchline, of being positioned as the family's failure when in reality I was possibly the family's greatest success, just in ways they'd never bothered to understand. I smiled. I sat down my wine glass. I didn't engage. I didn't defend myself. I didn't say anything that would make the situation worse or create drama at my brother's wedding. I simply turned and walked away, moving toward the exits with the kind of quiet grace that comes from having practiced invisibility for decades. I was heading toward the main lobby of the country club when a man intercepted me. He was tall, probably in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military background. He was wearing an impeccable charcoal suit that probably cost more than my bridesmaid dress, and he moved with the confident efficiency of someone who was accustomed to being in control of situations. "Miss Anderson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Jackson Morrison. I'm your head of security." I stopped walking. I looked at his face, trying to understand whether I was being set up for some kind of continuation of the humiliation, whether this was some elaborate prank designed to extend the embarrassment from the rehearsal dinner. "I apologize for approaching you this way," he continued, apparently reading the confusion on my face. "I was asked by someone on your board to attend the wedding and ensure that your security detail could be activated if needed. When I overheard the conversation in the rehearsal lounge, which I wasn't trying to do, but the acoustics in that room were terrible, I realized you might benefit from knowing that someone actually understood who you are." I looked at him for a long moment. Jackson Morrison, my head of security, a man I'd never met in person, despite the fact that he'd been managing security protocols for all 8 of my grocery store locations for the past 2 years. A man who I'd only ever communicated with through email and quarterly reports and legal documentation. A man who knew things about my business that my own family had never bothered to learn. "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. "Thank you for checking on me. With respect, Miss Anderson," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he dealt with this kind of situation before. "You don't look fine. You look like someone who has been carrying something too long, and just had the weight of it acknowledged by someone who shouldn't have any power over you. I'm offering you an exit strategy if you want one." "Shall we leave?" The question hung in the air between us. Shall we leave? Should I walk away from the wedding? Should I just disappear and leave my brother wondering where I'd gone? Should I allow myself that kind of dramatic exit after spending my entire life being the quiet, accommodating sister who never made waves? I thought about it. I really thought about it. I thought about how much I wanted to leave. I thought about how good it would feel to simply walk away and let my absence be its own statement. I thought about my brother Marcus discovering that I'd gone, wondering if I'd overheard him, trying to calculate whether I'd been hurt enough to create drama at his own wedding. And then I thought about something else. What would leaving accomplish except to confirm his narrative that I was someone who wasn't strong enough to handle disappointment, someone who was volatile and unreliable, someone who needed to be managed carefully? No, I said to Jackson Morrison, I'm not going to leave, but I want you to stay if you don't mind. I want you to stay at the wedding. And I want you to understand that what my brother said in that room was not a reflection of who I actually am or what I have actually accomplished. Jackson nodded, and something that might have been respect flickered across his face. That's the right call, he said. I'll be here for the rest of the wedding. I was hyper-aware of Jackson's presence. I saw him near the bar when I was talking to other wedding guests. I saw him at dinner seated at a table near the back with other staff members, but occasionally catching my eye across the room. I saw him during the speeches, standing at attention near the exits, and I moved through the wedding with a kind of grace that surprised even me. I smiled at the right moments. I laughed at the jokes during the reception. I danced with my brothers when we were supposed to dance. I hugged my brother during the family photos. I was present in all the ways that family members are expected to be present at these events. But something had shifted. The humiliation of the rehearsal dinner had transformed into something else. A kind of clarity. A recognition that my invisibility to my family wasn't a reflection of my value. It was a reflection of their limitations, their inability to see beyond the categories they'd already created, their unwillingness to understand that success could look different than what they defined it as. On my flight back to Chicago the next morning, I made some decisions. I opened my laptop and I drafted an email to my board. I told them I was ready to consider growth opportunities I'd previously rejected. I told them I was ready to scale. I told them I was ready to move from a regional operation to something truly national, which would require additional capital and visibility. I also called Jackson Morrison and asked him to arrange a meeting with my full executive team. I told him I wanted to hire a public relations firm. I told him I wanted to start speaking at conferences and writing about food system equity. I told him I wanted to make my work visible in ways I'd never been willing to before. Did something happen? Jackson asked. You've been declining these opportunities for 2 years. Yes, I said. Something happened. I stopped being invisible and I realized that staying invisible was a choice I didn't have to make anymore. 3 months after the wedding, I gave a keynote speech at the National Conference on Urban Agriculture. The speech was about building businesses that solved real problems in underserved communities. It was about food system equity. It was about the courage it takes to build something different from what your family expected of you. The speech went viral on social media. It was shared millions of times. Business schools started discussing it in their curriculum. The video has been watched over 5 million times. Articles appeared in Forbes, Fast Company, Harvard Business Review. Journalists started reaching out with interview requests. And then someone, I still don't know who, connected the dots. A journalist found the story about the wedding, found the comment Marcus had made, found the narrative about the family embarrassment, and suddenly the story wasn't just about a successful entrepreneur. It was about the gap between how family sees you and who you actually are. It was about invisibility and visibility, about achievement and recognition, about the courage it takes to pursue something different. The headline was everywhere. Woman called family embarrassment. At Brother S. wedding turns out to be multi-million-dollar entrepreneur. She built a $187 million company while her family called her a failure. The uncomfortable truth about family judgment. My family received phone calls from journalists. My father, who had spent decades dismissing what I did, suddenly wanted to understand the business. My mother started telling people about my success at country club gatherings, positioning herself as someone who had always supported my vision. Marcus called me, his voice careful and strange, and asked if I'd consider him as an investor. I told him no, not with anger, but with clarity. I told him that I'd built this company without him, and I wasn't interested in bringing him into it now, just because external validation had finally made my work seem worth his attention. I told him that his judgment had never been a factor in my decision-making. So, his newfound approval wasn't necessary either. I love you, I said, and I meant it. But I don't need you to validate what I've built, and I don't need you to understand me. What I needed was for you to not mock me in front of other people, and you didn't meet that very low bar. The conversation ended awkwardly. We haven't spoken much since then. What I've learned from this entire experience is something that most people understand intellectually, but few people truly internalize. Invisibility is sometimes freedom. When nobody's watching you, you're free to build something real instead of something that just looks impressive. When nobody has expectations for you, you're free to pursue what actually matters to you instead of what you're supposed to care about. My family's dismissal of me had hurt, yes, but it had also protected me from their judgment in real time. They hadn't been following my career closely enough to second-guess my decisions. They hadn't been invested enough to try to redirect me toward what they thought I should be doing. They'd left me alone long enough to build something genuinely significant. Jackson Morrison remained my head of security and eventually became the chief operating officer of my company. He understood business in ways my family never would. He understood what it took to build something from nothing. He understood that success didn't have to look like they said it should. A year after the wedding, I was invited to speak at Northwestern University's business school. I accepted and I told the story of the family that didn't understand me, the brother who called me an embarrassment, the moment when I finally recognized that their judgment had never actually been my problem. The students asked if I forgave my family. I told them I didn't think forgiveness was the right framework. I told them I accepted that my family had done the best they could with the tools they had, and that what I'd learned was that I didn't need their understanding or their validation to know that my work mattered. Your worth isn't determined by whether the people who raised you understand your value. I told the students, sometimes, especially when you're choosing a different path, the people closest to you will be the ones who understand you the least. That's not a failure on your part. That is just what happens when you build something they never imagined was, because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's justice wrapped in grace. Silent revenge. Possible. I built my company from nothing in the margins while my family was busy judging me from the center of their own carefully constructed narratives. And I built it well. I built it honestly. I built it in ways that matter. That's what happens when you stop trying to be visible to people who are determined not to see, because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's justice wrapped in grace. Silent revenge.